There are so many strange unsolved mysteries from around the world that it's easy for some to be overlooked. These mysteries haven't received as much attention as others, but solving them would still make a huge difference in their fields. Just after midnight on July 12, 1973, fire departments in St. Louis, Missouri were alerted to a fire at a records building. The fire would continue for 4 days before finally being put out. To this day, the cause of the fire remains a mystery. The National Personnel Records Center describes the 1973 fire as the greatest records disaster in the US. The fire destroyed the 6th floor of the Military Personnel Records Center, and between 16 and 18 million personnel records were destroyed. The Records Center had been built a few decades earlier. At the time, there was still debate over whether sprinkler systems should be included in the designs of such buildings. While fires are obviously damaging, water can also destroy records. It was decided that the new Records Center would be built without a sprinkler system. For the first 18 years of its existence, that didn't seem to be an issue. When personnel left work on July 11, 1973, they had no idea that would soon change. There were several activists working on the 6th floor shortly before midnight that evening. They noticed nothing out of the ordinary as they went about their job. But at 16 minutes past midnight, a fire alarm was triggered on that floor. At the same time, a passing motorcyclist stopped to tell a security guard that there was fire coming from the building. Within minutes, the fire engines were on the scene. They would be joined by 40 other fire departments as they battled for 4 days to put out the fire. For 2 of those days, firefighters couldn't even enter the building. On the morning of July 16th, firefighters confirmed the disaster was over. Nobody had been hurt, but damage had been done. The 6th floor was completely destroyed. Reinforced concrete columns had collapsed and the roof was only held up by melted and twisted filing cabinets. The contents of many had been completely reduced to ash, even those that looked relatively unharmed from the outside. In the end, it was determined that 80% of the Army records for personnel discharged between November 1st, 1912, and January 1st, 1960, had been completely destroyed. 75% of Air Force records for personnel discharged between September 25th, 1947, and January 1st, 1964, whose surnames came alphabetically after Hubert, were also destroyed. The FBI began working on investigating the cause of the fire before it had even been put out. Unfortunately, the destruction of the 6th floor made it impossible to determine the cause. The case was closed and left unsolved, and has remained that way for 50 years. The mystery has allowed conspiracy theorists to run wild. While basic information about the personnel who had their records destroyed was found in other documents, the exact details of what was in those lost files will forever be an unsolved mystery. In January of 1857, as he prepared for his inauguration, President-elect James Buchanan fell ill with a mysterious disease. He was one of the hundreds of people to contract the illness. All seemed to have caught the disease at the National Hotel in Washington, D.C. The disease remains a medical mystery all these years later. Dozens of people lost their lives due to the sickness, and it's believed Buchanan himself came close to passing away. At the time, poisoning was a popular theory. Buchanan was a controversial president who was elected at a time of great tension in the country. He had what was described as Southern values and was a big believer in states' rights. He claimed he didn't want to get involved in the issue of slavery and pushed the issue down the road. It's not surprising that he decided to stay at the National. The hotel had gathered a reputation as being a place of luxury and sophistication, and was especially popular with Southern politicians. Many would take residence at the hotel while serving in the government. Buchanan chose to stay here while he prepared for his inauguration. Buchanan arrived on January 25th, along with 8 other guests. They dined in the banquet hall before retiring for the evening. Overnight, all the guests came down with a serious sickness that caused a great deal of pain. Over the next few days and weeks, it seemed to get worse. The president-elect was taken back home to recover, and at times it seemed like he might not make it to his inauguration. Buchanan did, and then went back to the National Hotel to celebrate with his inauguration dinner. This caused a second outbreak of the mysterious disease. On March 26th, 2 days after his inauguration, Buchanan's secretary and nephew, Elliot Lane, passed away at age 33. He was the first prominent victim, and his passing made headlines. Between 2 and 3 dozen others would succumb to the disease over the following months and years. Others were left with lifelong symptoms. There were accusations of poisoning, either deliberate or accidental. It was theorized that abolitionists had poisoned the hotel's food or water supply with arsenic. The disease did have some striking similarities with arsenic poisoning, but it wouldn't make sense to try to take out Buchanan when his vice president had even stronger anti-abolition views. An alternate theory was that rat poison had gotten into the water supply at the hotel. The National had a rat problem and had put poison down to deal with it. One of those rats was found in the hotel's water tank, but this water was only used for washing. But the rat problem was a sign of something else wrong with the hotel. It didn't have a sophisticated sewer system, even for the 1850s. It was theorized that bad air from the sewage system had caused the disease. Today, experts believe a disease like dysentery may have been the cause. It still didn't fit all the symptoms of this mysterious hotel disease, or why the illness only spiked during Buchanan's stays. The exact answer to this medical mystery may never be uncovered. There are a surprising number of mysterious eruptions throughout the world's history. Strange weather, oral history, and ice samples indicate a devastating volcanic eruption took place at a time, but the location of the volcano remains a mystery. This is the case with the 1452 and 53 mystery eruption. In the 1990s, scientists discovered something strange in ice cores from Antarctica. In the 1450s, there'd been a spike in sulfate in the atmosphere. At the time, the world was going through a mini ice age, and this spike only made the cool temperatures even worse. Closer examination showed that there were actually 2 sulfate spikes. One was dated to 1458. The earlier spike took place between 1452 and 1453. The impact of this eruption was felt around the world. In China, there were 40 days of constant snowfall in a region at the same latitude as northern Mexico. The Yellow Sea froze up to 13 miles away from the shore, and tens of thousands of people froze. In Europe and Central America, crops failed. Dry fog was seen in Constantinople in April and May. The natural environment also had the telltale signs of the mysterious eruption. As well as the ice cores in Antarctica, ice cores in Greenland showed the same spike. Here, there was even more evidence of the eruption. The rings from trees around the world also showed stunted growth in this period. The ice cores in Greenland were particularly interesting for scientists. For a while, it was believed a volcano in the region of the South Pacific might be responsible, but these cores indicated that the mysterious volcano was actually located in the northern hemisphere, likely somewhere in the tropics. This strange mystery just goes to show how much we still have to learn about even the most recent history of our world, and there are likely many more similar mysteries just waiting to be uncovered. There is no shortage of mysterious, unexplained noises heard around the world. From simple hums to sonar noises to loud booms, the possible explanations are just as mysterious. In 2012, a mystery boom heard in Jodhpur, India, caused panic, and it's not been solved. Jodhpur lies close to India's border with Pakistan, and there's a military airbase located nearby. More than 1,138,000 people were living in this city's walls in 2012. The mystery occurred at 11:25 a.m. on December 18, 2012. The people of Jodhpur were going about their day. A few may have been thinking about the end of the world prediction that suggested the apocalypse was only a few days away, but for most, it wouldn't have crossed their minds. Suddenly, a deafening noise came from the sky above. It shook window panes and broke glass. Some people became unsteady on their feet. Things fell from shop stalls. The noise was over almost as suddenly as it started. People looked to one another for answers, but there were none. The noise sounded like a sonic boom, which is caused when an object is moving faster than the speed of sound. Today, those are normally caused by military aircraft. Commercial aircraft don't fly as fast today. After confirming the Mayan prediction about the end of the world hadn't come 3 days early, it was suspected that the military had been the cause of the noise. It was suspected that either weapons malfunctions or a faster-than-sound aircraft was responsible. The military quickly denied this. A spokesperson came forward to say that there'd been no malfunction and no aircraft in the vicinity of Jodhpur. He emphasized that it would be impossible for this to be the case, as there were rules against flying at such speeds in populated areas. No other explanation has ever been found. There were no earthquakes that may have triggered the noise. It's been suggested that a meteorite may have caused the noise, but no records of a meteorite strike have been found. Jodhpur wasn't the only city to experience a suspected sonic boom in 2012, though. Other countries, including the US and UK, also reported similar noises earlier in the year. On one occasion, a green light was also seen. Little information about these noises has been made public, leaving the public wondering what caused this strange mystery. In March of 1945, the USS Willard Keith was traveling back to San Francisco from Catalina Island when its sonar picked up the sound of submarine turbines. It reacted quickly, dropping depth charges. Whatever it hit left behind an oil slick. What exactly it hit remains a mystery. The USS Willard Keith was a 376-foot-long destroyer-class ship. It had only been commissioned a few weeks earlier and was serving as a training trip for engineering personnel at the time. It would travel between San Francisco and the islands in the San Pedro Channel. It was on March 21st, on one of these return journeys, that operators noticed something strange on the sonar. Not far off the coast of California, there were distinct signs of a submarine operating beneath the water. The ship's skipper had already been sunk twice during the war, and he wasn't going to let this happen again. The ship turned around to travel back over the submarine and sent out several depth charges. Sailors on deck spotted an oil slick that appeared on the surface of the water. Something beneath the waves had sunk. When the ship traveled over that location again, there was no sign of any submarine. The US was operating submarines in the Pacific at the time, but those close to the shore were not supposed to be underwater. The senior sailors insisted the submarines had to have been an enemy vessel, but when the Willard Keith arrived back to shore, the crew was ordered not to say anything about the sunken submarine. The excuse was that it would cause people to panic if they knew the enemy was operating so close to shore. The sailors kept quiet about the hit and finished their service. One sailor, Bill Anderson, had almost completely forgotten about the sunken submarine until the 1990s. Bill had been 18 years old in 1945. He was an enlisted sailor who remembered asking how they knew they hadn't committed friendly fire. In the 1990s, he learned of an unidentified sunken submarine near Half Moon Bay. There were stories of divers being denied access to the site. One requested permission to scavenge mercury from the submarine. This seemed to confirm that the sunken submarine wasn't American. American subs didn't carry mercury, but during the Second World War, German subs did. Bill requested the logbook of the USS Willard Keith, only to discover that there was no mention of any submarine sinking. Despite the official denial, many sailors who had been aboard the ship on March 21, 1945, remembered the mysterious event. Bill spent his retirement searching for the mysterious submarine. There are many shipwrecks in that area, and finding the right one proved impossible. Sadly, he passed away without ever getting to the bottom of the mystery. Today, we still don't know whether this mystery sub was an enemy vessel or the victim of friendly fire. If the submarine was carrying mercury, it may have been some experimental craft that the US government was still trying to keep a secret in 1945. It's also possible that the submarine the mercury scavenger had found was not the same ship the USS Willard Keith sank. A third possibility is that the USS Willard Keith encountered something even more mysterious that day. The truth may never be uncovered. James Douglas Edgar was a celebrity pro golfer who would become famous twice. Once for inventing a special new swing that changed the sport, and again as a dark and disturbing unsolved mystery with a famously creepy backstory. By 1921, the 36-year-old Englishman had won multiple pro tournaments and was also teaching his special golf swing in Atlanta, Georgia. However, his career would come to a dark and unexpected ending when, on August 8th, two news reporters and an editor drove by a man face down on West Peachtree Street. They'd chanced upon the true crime story of a lifetime. The mystery person was James Douglas Edgar, and by the time an ambulance arrived, he was sadly no more. A crime scene investigator determined that he had been in the road when an automobile failed to stop. To solve the case, detectives began interviewing local car owners to see if anyone had damage to the front of their car. Cars were a luxury in the 1920s that few could afford, and the small number of cars in the area were not damaged. The case was closed until a coroner's report raised a particularly disturbing mystery with a creepy backstory that experts still cannot explain. To the medical examiner's surprise, the famous person was practically unscathed, except for an examination of his inner thigh, where a deep hole indicated the deliberate use of a blade rather than a car, and the case went on to become a famous crime. The true story behind the murder mystery case is unsolved, but there are a few possible theories within the true crime community to help explain what happened. The most famous story is that of James Douglas Edgar, who refused a request made by the mafia not to win an upcoming tournament. A few notorious individuals were rumored to have placed large bets on another golfer, Bobby Jones, and the organized crime family needed to make sure James Douglas Edgar did not win. A second possible reason for this unsolved case was infidelity. There were rumors that the celebrity was having an affair with a married Japanese woman. A beautiful Japanese woman has said to have been visiting Edgar's resting place in the years since his passing. Edgar had a wife and 2 children, but at the time of this dark mystery, they were back in England. While in England, he'd gotten into trouble for spending a little too much time with some of the female members of his golf club. In fact, it was one of the reasons why he had moved to America in 1919. A jaded husband could have taken his life in this crime story. Both of these stories sound plausible, but the real story will never be solved. And over 100 years later, it's safe to say the criminal responsible for this famous mystery will never be caught. Originally built in 1346, the Himeji Castle in Japan is thought to have a lucky history. But not for all. Behind its centuries of good fortune are a number of creepy backstories and scary mysteries that no one can explain. According to Japanese folklore, the castle is protected by magical tiles with inscriptions of ogre-like creatures and incantations meant to forever spare the fortification from any harm. What makes this seemingly normal castle one of the scariest places in the world is the outer courtyard, which is a winding maze meant to confuse invaders. It's here that contains a dark and disturbing secret history. When the walls of this maze were first being constructed, the bodies of many strong men were literally built into the wall as a way to provide more spiritual protection to the castle. And they're still inside of the walls to this day. Exactly how many is unknown, but it's one of the creepiest backstories about the place by far, and one of the darkest moments in the history of its construction. But the greatest mystery of the Himeji Castle is whether the magic ogre tiles and putting humans in the walls actually worked. The castle is one of the finest examples of early Japanese architecture in existence, simply because it's one of the few fortresses never to be attacked in its over 400 years of service. The castle even survived repeated aerial attacks by World War II planes without any structural loss. It's a strange but true historical coincidence that the fortress with the most spiritual protection was never touched by invaders. In the early 1930s, the Himeji Castle was declared a national treasure and has since been properly restored to its full beauty. To those who believe the Japanese folklore, this place will always remain well protected in ancient ways that most of the world simply regard as urban legend. The disappearance of Tim Molner was a scary mystery, which only became more disturbing once his body was eventually found. Tim was 19 when he disappeared in January of 1984. That morning, he drove his younger brother to school like normal, then began his journey to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University in Daytona Beach, Florida. On the way, he realized he forgot his bicycle, so he returned home to get it. His mother watched him leave for the final time. The scary mystery began for his family when he didn't return home that evening. He had used his parents' credit card to buy gas at Lake City, Florida. The attendant later confirmed to crime investigators that Tim was driving alone, eliminating theories of a carjacking. The entire story was highly unusual because Lake City is nowhere near where Tim went to university. The next clue came nearly 4 months later, when his prized 1969 Dodge Dart had been found abandoned in a parking lot near the Greyhound bus station just a week after Tim had last been seen. Tim cared a lot about his car, as evidenced by a very expensive toolkit for repairs, and he was unlikely to voluntarily abandon the Dodge. Tim's ID and wallet were found in the car, but the toolkit, the car radio, and Tim's bike were all strangely missing. After watching a 1996 broadcast of Unsolved Mysteries 10 years later, a viewer in Wisconsin recognized the description of the clothes that Tim had been wearing. In early 1986, the viewer had found a missing body in an ice sheet in the woods of Neosho, Wisconsin. The body had no ID, but was carrying a rusted set of keys. To solve this mystery, the Molner family sent DNA to test against the human remains, which were confirmed to be that of Tim. One of the keys found with him fit the lock of the family's home. There are so many unanswered questions in this scary mystery. Sadly, Tim's parents passed away before they could find out what happened to their son. On December 5, 1965, the USS Ticonderoga had finished the second mission in Vietnam and was on its way to Japan for maintenance. To keep everyone sharp and well-trained, the commander ordered a crew cut, which is a special missile loading exercise. As the strange but true story goes, a special B-43 warhead was loaded onto a jet, at which point Lieutenant Douglas Webster climbed into the cockpit and the crew manually pushed the large aircraft onto an industrial elevator. The final steps of the exercise should have been to remove the warhead, but the true story has a much more unbelievable ending. Lieutenant Webster somehow did not feel his jet moving backwards, and likewise missed the whistles and hand signals of a crew telling him to hit his brakes. He was, for some unknown reason, mysteriously looking down as the aircraft plunged into the ocean. This is quite a scary mystery because the B-43 was a live thermonuclear device, and it had just been lost at the bottom of the ocean. After an extensive rescue mission, only the lieutenant's helmet was found, and the nuclear weapon has spent the past 57 years at the bottom of the ocean. No one knows what the lieutenant was looking at before his final moments took place. The scary mystery of Pankaj Bhasin is a dark and disturbing real horror story for all involved. On July 13, 2018, emergency responders went to a crime scene on the 1200 block of King Street in Alexandria, Virginia, that seemed too strange to be true. 35-year-old Pankaj had used a blade on a store manager over 50 times and tried to get into a stranger's vehicle, which made them call 911. When found by responding law enforcement officers, Pankaj was lacking pants and was stained in red. The store manager did not survive the encounter. At first, criminal investigators were stumped about this unsolved mystery because the two did not know each other and had no reason for such animosity. Police detectives were eventually able to solve the dark and disturbing mystery and learn the true story behind the horrifying crime. According to Pankaj, he followed the manager from an alley into the store, where he saw something scary. The person he was talking to, 65-year-old store manager Thomas Jackson, began to turn into a werewolf, and so he used a box cutter on the man to save himself. Exactly what he was thinking is a scary mystery, but in his mind, if he did not do so, then 99% of the universe would be destroyed. These paranormal werewolf stories were true to him at the time, and seemed very real. While he did commit a horrific crime, he was not a real criminal in the eyes of the law, and after serving 3 years at a mental health treatment center as his sentence, he was released into society again. The man would eventually become the center of another strange but true mystery when he made a Facebook dating profile online. Much to the horror of those who once knew Thomas Jackson, who thought this was a horror story waiting to happen. On the Facebook page, Pankaj had copied text from an old dating profile made before he had taken a life. The dating profile talked about recently getting back from 2 years of travel, which was technically true, but no disclosure or update about his history was added. A court order barred him from using many similar online services. Whether or not he would have used the website for anything other than dating is a scary mystery that will never be known for 100% certain. In the space of just a few months, 3 people in India had their lives taken by an elusive serial killer. The criminal targeted the elderly and took valuables and jewelry from their bodies before disappearing into the night. He also seemed to go to great lengths to hide his identity, even taking bullet casings from the bodies to ensure no weapon experts would be able to determine the weapon that he was using. But just a few small mistakes revealed his identity to the police. The criminal would turn out to be 36-year-old Monish Naik. Naik had left his abusive father's home at a very young age, moving towns and picking up work as a dishwasher at a restaurant. As he grew older, he learned to cook and worked as a chef, as well as other odd jobs. But it wasn't enough money for Naik. He was involved in a variety of petty theft crimes. Between 1998 and 99, he spent about 2 years in jail after being arrested for a bike theft. He was never convicted, but Naik had nobody to bail him out, so he spent the time in jail until the case was dropped. While in jail, he met other criminals who taught him new tricks for making money, tricks he put to use after he was released. But to the outside world, he had turned his life around. He got married, had a son, and ran a restaurant with his wife. Things were going well, but Naik had ambitions for more. In 2016, he broke into the home of a railway ticket collector and stole a revolver and 37 bullets. The crime was reported to police, but police were never able to catch the thief. Naik used the weapon to hold up rich people. He selected elderly or infirm people, as he himself was a slight man and he wanted to ensure he couldn't be overpowered. After following them long enough to make sure they actually had valuables on them, he ambushed his victims in a secluded location and forced them to hand over jewelry. Anybody who resisted would find a bullet in their head. Between October of 2018 and January of 2019, 3 people passed away at Naik's hands. Despite the caution he took, there were 2 small mistakes Naik made. He knew the areas where he committed the crimes well, so he knew where CCTV cameras would be located. But he became careless after one of his crimes and went to a tea stall after taking the lives of one of his victims. His face was caught on camera at the stall, and while police couldn't be sure that this was the person responsible for the nearby crime, he was considered a person of interest. This prompted Naik to suddenly stop his crimes out of fear of being caught. He changed his appearance, growing a beard and cutting his hair, and even moved his family away from the area. His second mistake would prove to be much more costly. After a robbery gone wrong in February of 2019, Naik used his cell phone. Police linked the robbery to the other crimes and looked into the mobile numbers in the area where the crime had taken place. Naik's number was just one of those that police believed could possibly have belonged to the criminal. But when the phone was switched off shortly after the attack, it became even more suspicious. The phone suddenly became active again in September, and police acted on the hunch. They traced the phone to Naik's home, where he confessed to the crimes. He also confessed to taking the life of a 4th victim, a jewelry shop owner who had been buying his stolen goods. The son of Sal could hardly be described as a criminal genius, but he may have gotten away with taking the lives of 3 men if he had not been quite as careless as he was. Salvatore Perrone had a history of minor brushes with the law. He had previously been to court for accusations of trespassing, being drunk and disorderly, stalking, and burglary. He was also extremely disliked in the Staten Island neighborhood where he lived, but there was little to suggest he was capable of taking the life of an innocent person. Perron was an independent apparel salesman by trade, working as a middleman to sell clothing to stores. It was a job that was not going well. Years earlier, he had run a successful clothing store and even trademarked his own name with the vision of creating a fashion line. But those dreams had pretty much died out, and he was living on very little money. It was through his work that he met the victims. What triggered his violent crimes is unknown. Perron's neighbors described him as a loner with a short temper, but it didn't appear to be fits of anger that prompted his crimes. Instead, he went to the Bay Ridge store owned by a man named Mohammed Gabili near closing time on July 6, 2012, and took his life without any provocation. Perron covered his body in clothing from the store and fled the scene. Over the next few months, the bodies of two more store owners were found in their own store. They had both been attacked shortly before closing time, and their bodies were found with bullet and knife wounds. It didn't take long for police to release a picture of the suspect. The stores Perron had targeted had CCTV cameras, and police released footage of Perron carrying a duffel bag that he used to carry his weapons. Not long after the attack, Perron targeted a man that would have become his fourth victim. Luckily for the victim, customers disturbed the attack and Perron fled the scene. But despite his image having been circulated in the local area, he had taken what had become his signature duffel bag with him to the scene, and so the victim knew that this was the criminal police were looking for. The victim was able to identify Perron to police, and police tracked him down at his girlfriend's apartment. There, they found the duffel bag and weapons he had used to commit his crimes, and there was even DNA evidence from two of the victims on the weapons and the bag. Perron initially confessed, claiming Italian and then Palestinian CIA agents had told him to commit the actions, then rescinded his confession and claimed he was being set up. He was found guilty of all three crimes and sentenced to life in prison. Juan Corona took the lives of at least 25 men in the early 1970s, and was only caught after preparing one of the burial sites a little too early. Corona was a Mexican migrant living in California. He had originally worked as a picker on a farm, but had started his own labor contractor business, supplying workers to other farms in the area. Compared to his brother, a homosexual man with violent tendencies, he seemed completely average. He had a wife and family, and didn't appear to have any run-ins with the law. That view on Corona quickly changed in 1971. In May of that year, a Japanese farmer hired Corona to arrange workers for his orchard. While the laborers were at work, the farmer took a walk through the orchard and found a grave-sized hole. The workers nearby either knew nothing about it or didn't say anything. There was nothing in the hole, but later that evening, the farmer went back to discover it had been filled in. Something didn't sit right with the farmer, and he contacted police. Police dug up the hole to find the body of Kenneth Whitaker. Kenneth had been violently attacked with a weapon, and a cross was cut into the back of his head. He was a transient worker and hadn't been reported missing by any friends or family. Before police could even really begin to investigate the crime, another body was discovered on the nearby farm. Another transient worker had been attacked in much the same manner as Kenneth and buried. The same day, another body was found. Excavation of the surrounding farmland discovered 25 bodies in less than a month. They had all been there less than half a year, and police couldn't be sure there weren't more older victims buried in the area. But they called off the excavation after number 25. Almost all the victims were transient workers who had been hired by Corona, but the biggest clue linking him to the crimes was buried with two of the bodies. With the body of Melford Sample, police found two receipts dated May 21st, signed by Corona. With one of the final bodies to be found, police found two bank deposit slips, along with his signature on them. Corona was arrested, but he claimed he was innocent. He put the blame on his brother, given there was some evidence homosexuality was involved in the crimes, but his brother had been out of the country when the crimes took place. He was found guilty of the crimes and eventually admitted that he'd committed the acts after being sentenced. Charles Subraj earned the nickname the Serpent for his ability to evade capture. But it was one small mistake that turned him from a fugitive to a prisoner at one of the most overcrowded prisons in the world. Subraj was born in Saigon to a Vietnamese mother and Indian father, though his parents split when he was very young and his mother remarried a French army officer. The young Subraj moved to France, where he was educated at a private school. There, he would learn much of the charm that made him a successful con man when he grew up. As an adult, Subraj traveled along the so-called hippie trail in Southeast Asia, charming tourists before giving them mood-altering substances and robbing them. He would acquire accomplices, mostly women, who he came across while trying to find new victims. But it wasn't long before his crimes escalated. It's not clear why Subraj switched from simply robbing his victims to taking their lives. It's possible it started out as an accidental overdose before Subraj realized that this was the best way to stop his victims from identifying him. But in the 1970s and 1980s, he would take the lives of dozens of young tourists. Most of his crimes occurred in Thailand, Malaysia, and India, but he was active as far west as Greece. Investigators were able to identify Subraj long before they captured him. A stash of passports was found in the flat that he shared with a Canadian girlfriend. The passports were from a range of countries, and it would later be discovered they could all be matched to victims. Another tenant in the building where Subraj lived was able to provide investigators with important information. Eventually, the name of Subraj's girlfriend. His girlfriend's parents gave investigators details of an emergency contact in France, Subraj's mother, finally confirming the conman and criminal's identity. But getting their hands on the criminal was much harder. It wasn't until Thai authorities started to take the crime seriously and issued an Interpol notice that he was finally intercepted. This was when he made the mistake that would leave him no time to run from the authorities. Subraj was targeting a group of French tourists when he mixed up the doses of the substances he gave to them. The substance was much stronger than he had been expecting, and the tourists became violently ill in the lobby of the hotel where they were staying. The police were called and Subraj was captured. He was linked to cases in other parts of the world. It wouldn't be the last time Subraj was caught. He would escape from prison and the grasp of authorities multiple times in the following years, but is currently serving a life sentence in Nepal. Between 1999 and 2004, a string of violent crimes was taking place in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. In the span of 1 year, between January of 1999 and January of 2000, 4 women had their lives taken in a brutal fashion, their bodies severely disfigured after they had passed away. Their bodies were dumped in secluded places, sometimes posed in a way that suggested the culprit had a dark sense of humor. In other cases, so disfigured it was hard to tell if they were even human. Police had no clues to go on. Most of the victims were prostitutes, aged between 30 and 55 years old. There were no witnesses or any camera footage that could have given police anything to go on. Police did have some hairs that were found with some of the victims, but the DNA matched nobody in the database, so it led to a dead end. After a few months, the criminal took another victim's life, again leaving no clues behind. In 2003, another victim would be added to the total, and police also connected a 1994 crime that took the life of an 81-year-old woman in the same area. Despite the bodies piling up, police were no closer to catching the criminal. That same year, police believed that they may have gotten a break in the case. A man named Derek Todd Lee was arrested for taking the lives of 7 other women in the Baton Rouge and Lafayette areas of Louisiana. Investigators and the local media began to speculate that he may have been involved in more unsolved crimes, even though the modus operandi didn't exactly line up. However, the hairs found with some of the bodies didn't match Lee, and police began to realize there had been 2 serial killers targeting women in the area. In 2004, another victim was discovered, but this time there was another clue that would lead to the criminal's capture. Tire tracks were found near the body. A cast was taken of the tracks, and the tire treads were examined. It was determined a relatively rare Goodyear tire had created the tracks, and police worked with stores in the area to narrow down a list of about 600 people who could have been responsible for the crime. All were brought in for questioning and to have their DNA tested. Even before the DNA test came back, there was one man that caught police's attention. Sean Vincent Gillis was a man in his 40s from Baton Rouge. He had been a strange and angry child and had grown into an angry adult, especially after his mother left to pursue film work in other parts of the country. It was stress that had driven him to attack his first victim, but he couldn't explain why he had taken the lives of the other women. He called himself pure evil after he confessed to the crimes and showed no remorse. Those said if he was released, he would probably go on to commit other heinous acts. On September 13, 1992, a hiker in Missoula County, Montana made a horrifying discovery when his dog chanced upon a rigid body partially sticking out of the dirt. The blade was twisted in the chest with enough force to snap the handle. This case was a real mystery to crime scene detectives as they cordoned off the area to begin their forensic investigation. Their findings suggested the body had been dragged to this location because the man's jacket and wool sweater were above his head. Also found near the body were 2 discarded baseball hats and a red splattered shirt, all of which investigators took as evidence. Whoever had done this most likely cut their hand while thrusting the blade, leaving DNA behind after wrapping the shirt around their hand and applying pressure. Getting the John Doe case solved proved to be a difficult mystery. The man had been dragged to Orange Avenue Ranch or Peachtree Camp, an area off of I-90 where people without a home would often congregate. On this person, investigators found papers documenting nearby visits to the local homeless shelter, the last one being August 25th. Using this information, investigators identified the John Doe as 49-year-old William Timothy Adams. However, the true story behind this crime mystery was still far from solved. William Adams had left his family long ago to begin a new life wandering the tracks, jumping from train to train. He lived this way by choice and would occasionally visit his Montana relatives. He had no enemies in this area, but law enforcement detectives knew some local troublemakers who could have done this to him. The investigation went nowhere and was added to their list of cold case files. It wouldn't be until the formation of the Missoula County Cold Case Unit in 2019 that the files would be reopened. A retired detective contacted the Cold Case Unit to remind them of the William Adams mystery. The ex-detective had put many hours into the case and really wanted to know what had happened to this man once and for all. Cold case detectives knew that DNA technology was much better now than 1992, and so they resubmitted the red-stained shirt that they kept as evidence. The suspect's DNA on the shirt ruled out most of their suspects except for one. Leonard 8-Ball Owen had led a life of crime for quite a while and had plenty of stories that were strange but true. At the age of 18, he and his friends helped some inmates escape from a prison facility by tossing hacksaws through the windows, which the inmates used to file through the bars. Leonard Owen was caught and put away for his crime. By 1975, he was back in trouble for burglary after holding up 2 hotel clerks. As investigators examined more of his criminal history, they learned that in 1998, he was accused of taking another man's life with a blade in Mason County, Iowa. That was where 23-year-old John C. Vigor was found in the road near railway tracks in a crime scene that shared many similarities to the unsolved mystery of William Adams. To prove beyond a doubt that this was the person responsible, the cold case unit teamed up with a nonprofit called Season of Justice, who paid for an expensive and extensive genetic profile. By comparing DNA from the shirt to a national DNA database, they were able to find a list of distant relatives. They then painstakingly traced everyone's family tree, member by member, until the scientific evidence led them to the brother of Leonard Owen. His brother, however, complied and provided DNA samples. Leonard Owen had passed away in 2005 from lung complications. Nonetheless, the brothers' test results showed that 8-Ball was the criminal responsible. 3 decades later, the unsolved mystery was finally solved. In 2011, 26-year-old Giselle Preston of Anaheim, California, was an aspiring counselor and loving mother, and was excited to welcome a new child into the world, her 3rd one. On Christmas Eve, she and her husband, William Wallace, went to a Christmas party and then got into an argument back home that became quite physical. A glass table was shattered, and there were numerous other impacts before the night was through. The next morning, her excited children were told by their father that Christmas was ruined. Their mother sat on the couch wearing sunglasses, stony and silent. One of her children tried to get her attention, and she said nothing and felt cold to the touch. At 9:30 a.m. on Christmas Day 2011, paramedics in Anaheim, California received a shocking call from William Wallace. He told operators that his wife was unresponsive on the couch. The paramedics summoned the police to a potential crime scene. Suspicions immediately turned to William, and he was arrested. He told them that Giselle had gotten drunk and fallen into a glass table, hence the 911 call, but investigators did not buy his story. Neighbors would testify that they heard William and Giselle arguing the night before, and William admitted to harming Giselle during the argument. Giselle's family accused William of being violent towards her on multiple occasions throughout their relationship, and that Giselle was trying to build up the courage to leave him. Sadly, she wasn't able to leave before it was too late, resulting in the events of Christmas Day of 2011. It would take 10 years for William Wallace to go to trial for what he did, owing to the number of witness testimonies and pieces of forensic evidence that had to be collected before the trial. He was kept in prison while these materials were assembled. In 2021, William Wallace was found guilty and received a sentence to serve 15 years in prison, with credit for the 9 that he'd already served. During his trial, he admitted to arguing with Giselle that night before a party, and his defense claimed that Giselle had caused the injuries to herself after being intoxicated. On June 13, 1993, residents at an apartment block in Minneapolis put in a complaint to their building manager after the water had been leaking in from the apartment of Jean Ann Childs. When someone was sent to check her apartment, they discovered her body. The shower had been left running, which explained the leaking water, and the police were immediately called to the scene. Crime scene investigators described it as horrific and like nothing they'd ever seen before. Jean's body was transported to the local coroner's office, and forensic investigators did a full sweep of her apartment. Jean's DNA, along with the DNA of an unknown male, was found inside. Despite hundreds of interviews, the case would go unsolved for 29 years. As an escort, Jean used her apartment to host clients, making it difficult for investigators to narrow down a pool of suspects. Investigators began working their way through a list of clients, but found themselves overwhelmed. With no match on the DNA found in Jean's apartment, the cold case became an unsolved Minnesota mystery. For years, investigators continued looking into Jean's unsolved case, but they were always missing that crucial piece of evidence. Then, in 2018, the Minnesota police partnered with a private laboratory to conduct a genealogical analysis of the DNA found in Jean's apartment. This new groundbreaking analysis led them to 2 possible suspects, and now all investigators had to do was obtain a DNA profile for comparison. One of the suspects was identified as Jerry Arnold Westrom, a father of 3 who had an extensive criminal record in Minneapolis and St. Paul. In January of 2019, Minneapolis police followed Jerry to a hockey game and obtained a napkin which he had used to wipe his mouth. This napkin was seized as evidence and compared to the unknown male DNA found in Jean's apartment in 1993. To the shock and amazement of the Minneapolis Police Department, Jerry Arnold Westrom's DNA was a match, and he was finally arrested in 2020. Using a forensic analysis of the splatter patterns left all over the crime scene as evidence, prosecutors described in great detail stories of how he had followed her from room to room while slowly using the blade more than 60 times. Jerry denied any involvement in the crime and said the theories were not true. But with the evidence mounted against him, he knew that the game was up. In August of 2022, Jerry was found guilty and is facing life in prison for his crimes. On June 20th, 1978, 22-year-old Carla Brown of Wood River, Illinois, and her fiancé Mark moved in together. A day later, tragedy would strike, sending Carla's family on a years-long true crime mystery. Incredibly, Carla's case would be solved and justice would be served thanks to one piece of evidence. After living there for only one day, Mark came home and found the house eerily silent. Mark moved between every room looking for Carla, but there was no sign of her. When he made it to the home's basement, he found his fiancée with her face in a bucket of water, not moving and her hands bound. He tried to perform emergency CPR, but it was too late. A friend who was supposed to be helping them move furniture into their new place found Mark and called 911. The Wood River Police Department immediately considered Mark a suspect, but he was quickly ruled out after producing an airtight alibi. DNA evidence was not available to investigators at the time, and they began interviewing everyone who knew Carla and Mark to see if they had any known enemies. When that didn't work, they focused on John Prant, who lived next door to Carla. After a criminal profile was made, the Wood River police considered him even more. 2 of his friends, John and another unnamed man, were over at his house the night before her life was taken. During their questioning, Paul said that he was hanging out with his friend John for the day, but his friend said that he had applied for a job. Paul also did not pass a lie detector test, but John Prant did. Even though he'd passed the lie detector test, John would allegedly later tell friends details that only the person responsible would have known about the crime. He said he had seen the missing body, knew about the water, and that she would have teeth marks. What investigators had never told the public was that Carla had teeth marks on her shoulder. A mold of his teeth was made, and now all that was left to do was re-examine the body and compare the marks. John told one of his friends, who was now working as an informant wearing a wire, that he worried about the upcoming forensic test, as he would get blamed. The Wood River Police Department arrested John after it was found that the dental mold fit the marks on Carla. As a result of this evidence and the testimony of several witnesses who said that John had told them things that only the person responsible would have known, he was found guilty and sentenced to 75 years in prison in 1983. The validity of the evidence would later be called into question, with John Prant being paroled in 2019. Many still believe that John is guilty, and DNA evidence was tested, although the profile found underneath Carla's fingernails was too old to be tested. Until more evidence comes to light, we may never know whether John Prant is really responsible for what happened to Carla that June afternoon. 27-year-old Mallory Manning was described as a sweet and caring young woman who, despite her issues, cared deeply for her friends and family. In 2008, Mallory was a known street worker in New Zealand and was looking forward to spending the holidays with those she loved. Unfortunately, that never happened, and nobody has ever been charged in what investigators believe is an unsolved true crime mystery. On December 18, 2008, Mallory donned her coat and a distinctive pink skirt and blue and white bikini top and headed out to Manchester and Peterborough streets in Christchurch, where her regulars knew to find her. By December 19th, her missing body was found at 6:40 a.m. by an early morning kayaker who saw something strange floating in the Avon River. According to reports, Mallory had been seen with a client at around 10:35 p.m. the night before, and other witnesses testified that a local biker gang had also been in the area. Data from a cell phone tower allowed case investigators to retrace her final moments before mysteriously disappearing. She was moving fast in a vehicle. Final text messages let them further narrow down suspects. Other clues were as follows. Her watch had malfunctioned from water damage at around 11 p.m. Marks on her body suggested she had been dragged through dense weeds. It looked like she'd put her arms up to defend herself against a blade and a metal pole. There were also marks around her neck. Finally, DNA belonging to an unidentified male was found on Mallory's body, but to this day, this profile has only been known as Male B. After ruling out a number of clients as suspects, police investigators turned to a local gang chapter of the Mongrel Mob. Detectives knew that women had to pay a protection fee if they wanted to be allowed to work the streets. A gang member was convicted with the crime, but later won an appeal years later when the evidence was deemed inadmissible. The exact events surrounding the trial have never been released to the public, but ever since the overturning of the case, Mallory's case has gone cold. The marks on her body were so extensive that detectives believe there has to be more than one person involved, as one man alone could not inflict so much damage. Anyone with information is asked to contact Crime Stoppers at 0800-555-111. The unsolved mystery of Ina Langstaff surrounds a kind and clever 24-year-old woman with ambitions to work in Europe. Someone tragically took her life in 1987, and we may never know the true story as her crime case has never been solved. Ina had skipped the final year of high school and gone to study at Northern Arizona University. She wanted to someday work in the US Embassy in France, but was living in Flagstaff, Arizona at the time of the crime. She lived with a roommate and her cat in an apartment complex on Tucson Avenue. On the morning of November 7, 1987, police were called to the apartment complex to check for a gas leak. Some gas meters had sustained car damage in the apartment complex parking area. The incident was being treated as a criminal investigation because it looked like a vehicle had fled the scene shortly afterwards. After no gas leak was detected, the police were eventually called back hours later when a resident discovered Ina's body a mere 100 feet away from the damaged gas meters. She had met an unexpected ending between a parked car and a wall. At first, police believed a vehicle had done this to her, perhaps even the same driver who had damaged the gas meters. But marks on her body showed a sharp object had been used by the criminal responsible. Somehow, the police did not notice her the first time they were called out. It's possible that police had simply overlooked her, but it's unlikely given how close she was to where they were investigating. Police went door to door for information to help get the crime mystery solved. Ina's roommate said that she left the apartment between 11 and 11:30 p.m. to walk her cat. Her roommate claimed Ina never made it home. Given the body was found just after 8 a.m., police were looking at a 9-hour window in which the crime might have taken place. They believed Ina might have gone to a nearby party, but couldn't confirm if this story was true. Few other crime scene details about Ina's case investigation have been released to the public. 2 people were arrested early on, including a man who was suspected of taking the lives of 2 other people in California the December after Ina lost her life. But none were ever charged, and police had no evidence either was involved. The mysterious case has remained unsolved ever since. In September of 1975, the body of a young woman was found after spending weeks in a side canyon of the Little Colorado River. Later that October, she would be identified through dental records as Deborah Carrick, a missing person who had an open investigation that had begun months ago in August. She was found at the bottom of a cliff and could have slipped, But as soon as some of her belongings turned up miles away in California, investigators knew the sharp blow to her head was deliberate. They recreated a timeline leading up to the unsolved mystery. In July, Deborah had left her parents' home in Maryland to travel to California with her boyfriend for an August wedding. After 2 weeks of hitchhiking between bus rides, the two parted ways on August 2nd. The next couple of weeks are well documented by travel diaries and phone calls home. Deborah got to visit many of the national parks and met new people. At some point in South Dakota, she befriended a man named Vern, who she traveled with through a few more national parks before separating on August 16th, the last time Deborah would call home. Days before she went missing, she sounded normal as she told her sister about plans to go to the Grand Canyon with 3 French girls. The following day, August 17th, Deborah checked into the Flamingo Hotel in Flagstaff, Arizona, paying with traveler's checks. The next day, August 18th, she left for the Grand Canyon and disappeared. Her belongings were later found in Santa Rosa, California, in what was described as a white nylon bag, which may have been the inside of a sleeping bag. The bag was found just 30 miles away from Deborah's planned destination. Coincidentally, this site was also where the missing bodies of 4 other women were found. Like Deborah, their unsolved cases still need solving. Adding to the mystery behind the case were the traveler's checks. An unidentified man had been cashing in these checks, which were in Deborah's name, on September 2nd and 3rd. The first check was a forged signature that was cashed in Colorado. The man then traveled south with the last 3 checks being cashed in New Mexico. It seemed likely that the person responsible for taking Deborah's life and the person who cashed the checks weren't the same person, but neither has been identified. This true crime case remains unsolved. The unsolved case of Joseph Elwell is one of the most mysterious types of true crime stories. Locked door mysteries. Joseph was found barely alive by his housekeeper, Marie Larson, at 9 a.m. on June 11, 1920, in his New York City home. He was sat in his armchair. There was a hole in his forehead, and the round landed on the coffee table. Its shell casing was on the floor along with the mail that he had been holding. All the doors leading to the house were locked. News of this strange and mysterious case quickly made headlines. His wife, Helen Derby Well, had separated from Joseph. Her ex-husband was an unfaithful 44-year-old womanizer who kept the contact details of over 50 women. Many of the women also had house keys. Investigators hoped to have the crime solved after finding this evidence at his home. They now had a long list of criminal suspects who had an opportunity to take Joseph's life. As a famous bridge player and a wealthy investor, Joseph certainly had his pick of women throughout the marriage. Could this mystery be explained by a jilted lover or one of the many angry husbands? If the criminal had let themselves in using a spare key and then left, then how was the door still locked from the inside? The more investigators prodded, the greater the mystery became. The prior evening, Joseph had gone to the Ritz-Carlton with his latest love interest, Viola Krause, and Viola's sister and brother-in-law, and they also watched a show at a New Amsterdam theater. Viola's ex-husband, Victor von Schlegel, had also been at the Ritz and the theater on that night, and there was a confrontation at the theater that Viola later said was nothing serious. Joseph returned home alone between 2 and 2:30 a.m. on the day of the crime. True to form, he took a phone call from Viola around this time, and then made a number of phone calls of his own. One was to his stables at 4:30 a.m., where he kept a number of racehorses. Naturally, there was nobody to answer the phone at this time, and it wasn't unusual for Joseph to make these middle-of-the-night calls. His last phone call was a little after 6 a.m. If their timeline was true, the crime had taken place sometime after 6:30 a.m. It wasn't long after this that he had been collecting his mail, the mail that was at his feet when he was discovered. Police also discovered 2 partial cigars in the room with Joseph. Since one was his favorite brand and the other was a generic type that he would have never chosen, Police did not know if he had a conversation or simply ignored the person in the house, though they could not figure out why he would do so while sorting through his mail. Today, the cigar would have been the key to solving this mystery through DNA evidence, but at the time, there was little evidence police could find. The case went cold and remains unanswered. The true crime story of Leroy Carter Jr. is an unsolved mystery that may involve the occult. Leroy was a Vietnam homeless war veteran on the streets who was simply down on his luck, but in no way a hardened criminal. When his body turned up in Golden Gate Park on the morning of February 8, 1981, there were no obvious suspects. At the time, the Golden Gate Park was a popular spot for the homeless to spend a night or two. It was also not uncommon for bodies to be dumped there. But this strange case was deeply disturbing and unlike anything any of the police officers had seen before. Leroy's body was found in his sleeping bag in a secluded area near Alvord Lake. His head, however, was not. Protruding from the stump were 2 ears of corn and an entire chicken wing. The rest of the chicken was found 50 yards away. Leroy was identified using his fingerprints, which were on criminal file due to petty misdemeanors, but that didn't offer any clues as to who the criminal responsible might be. Detective Sandy Gallant, who worked on the infamous Jonestown Massacre case, believed the head was being used for dark magic. After consulting with a specialist named Charles Wetley, who was a coroner, she learned of a cannibalistic ceremony that lasted 42 days. The final step after its contents were consumed was to return the head to where it was found. The police didn't believe this theory, and even Detective Gallant didn't find it very likely. But the case had an unexpected ending that is strange but true. The crime story concludes 42 days after Leroy's life was taken, at which point the missing head was found floating in the water, not far from where his body was found. Since no surveillance was set up at the location, police were unable to find new clues. It seems the only way this dark true crime might be solved is if someone comes forward with information more than 40 years later. It was just before midnight on April 7, 1983, when two CB radio enthusiasts stumbled across a crime scene on the secluded Gypsy Brae in Edinburgh. Sheila Anderson was in the road and barely alive. She passed away en route to the hospital. What makes this unsolved case so strange is that she had been seen by police officers just half an hour earlier, alive and well. Sheila had once been a shy young woman with ambitions of becoming a nurse. She married young and soon had 2 sons. Then her mother passed away, and Sheila turned to various addictions to try to cope with the loss. Before long, she stole from her family, and then finally turned to walking the streets to earn money. She had developed a reputation with police. On more than one occasion, she had stood in front of a car when a client tried to leave without paying. What detectives thought was a hit and run had a more sinister motive, as the car had quite deliberately passed over her repeatedly. At the time, some police forces might not have investigated Sheila's case too seriously due to her occupation, but local police launched a full investigation and were confident they would be able to find the criminal quickly. But it turned out many of the women who were working the same streets as Sheila wouldn't talk to police. They were scared of police and took unnecessary risks. On 2 occasions, a woman called authorities to say she had information about the unsolved case, but both times she failed to attend a meeting with officers. Police did get some real evidence from the crime scene. They knew from paint scraps found on her body that the car was red, but that didn't provide any leads that brought police any closer to solving the crime. In 2009, police were able to create a DNA profile from a sample taken from Sheila's body. It did not match anybody in the system, but with the advancement of genetic genealogy, this is one case that at least someday might be solved. On the 13th of June, 1980, a strange mystery started to unfold in Canberra, Australia, and to this day it remains unsolved. 18-year-old Elizabeth Herford had traveled back to her hometown of Canberra from Queensland, where she was working with her boyfriend as a fruit picker, after traveling around Australia. In Canberra, she was staying with her mother while visiting over the June long weekend. On the 13th of June, Elizabeth withdrew her last $1.50 from the bank and took a bus to the ANU bar, where she spent time drinking and playing pool with some of her school friends. At around 8:45 p.m., one of the men in the group asked how she was getting home, and she said that she wasn't sure as she had spent all of her money. He offered to buy her a bus ticket since he would be going on the bus anyway, and he waited for her so that they could walk to the city exchange together. But she never joined him, and he assumed that she'd slipped out of one of the bar's alternative exits. But the following day, her mother hadn't heard from her, and she contacted the police. When she still wasn't found, a search was undertaken that lasted for 2 weeks along the shore of Lake Burley Griffin, but to no avail. Several witnesses came forward to say that they had seen a woman, fitting Elizabeth's description, hitchhiking in the area, while one man said that he had seen a young woman arguing with a man next to a parked car on Commonwealth Avenue at around 9:30 p.m. Another witness stated that he had given a young woman who looked like Elizabeth a ride from Vernon Circle to Coronation Drive. The man who was seen arguing with Elizabeth was tracked down and questioned, but he maintained that the story was made up and that he was at home at the time. The case went cold, and despite yearly follow-ups by Elizabeth's family and unconfirmed sightings, no further clues were ever found, and her case remains an unsolved mystery. Jean Townsend was a 34-year-old theatrical costumer in London in 1954. At the time, she lived with her parents in Bempton Drive in South Ruislip, and on the evening of the 14th of September, she was a guest at a social function in the West End. Later that night, she caught the last Central Line train home, and at around 11:45 p.m., she was seen walking on Victoria Road by herself. This was the last time that anyone would see her alive. The following morning, she was found deceased on the north side of Victoria Road. When an autopsy was done, it was revealed that her own scarf had been used to end her life, and suspicion immediately fell on an American serviceman who was based at the South Ruislip station. This came after a resident in the area reported hearing a woman screaming for help, followed by 2 male voices arguing, one of which had an American accent. When the United States Air Force showed reluctance in helping with her case, the local people grew even more suspicious. A few women came forward to report that before the crime was committed, they had been harassed by strange men in the area where Jean was found. One woman, Jacqueline Cliff, reported that she had been approached by a man who was aged around 30 with an unusually high forehead. He also had an American accent and drove an American-type car. Another woman, Joanne Gala, reported that she had been attacked by a man on Victoria Road during the previous weekend. She also described him as having a high forehead, and soon it came to light that similar attacks had occurred in West Germany in the 1950s, suggesting that a British serviceman stationed there may have been responsible. The man with the high forehead would strike once more 3 weeks later when Doris Vanell was attacked outside of North Harrow Tube Station. She saw him board a train at Baker Street and waited for her to get off the train. When she realized that he was planning something, she confronted him and he attacked, but he managed to get away after a brief struggle. No further attacks were ever reported, and no further clues were ever found, leaving Jean's case to remain a scary mystery. The mysterious case of Lieutenant Hubert Chevis occurred at the Blackdown Camp in Camberley, England, on the 21st of June 1931, when he and his wife Frances sat down for dinner. One of Hubert's favorite dishes was partridge, and that evening, it was exactly what Frances was serving. But after taking one bite of the dish, Hubert made a face and pushed his plate away, stating that it tasted horrible. Not long after dinner, he started feeling ill and was soon struck with seizures and partial paralysis in certain parts of his body. Before long, he was also experiencing severe abdominal pain, and they called for medical help. After being examined, both Hubert and Frances were sent to the nearest hospital, where Francis managed to recover, but Hubert only made it to the next morning before passing away. When an autopsy was done, it revealed that he'd been a victim of strychnine poisoning. This prompted a police investigation, and when their home was searched, no poison was found in any of the other food that was served that night. When investigators asked to see the partridges that were being served, the cook informed them that they'd been destroyed in the oven, as she'd been instructed to do. This left police no option but to trace the path that the partridges took before being served at the house. They questioned the butcher from whom they were bought, but the partridges in the butchery were found to be clean. At the house, the birds had been kept in a meat safe, as was the norm at the time. They were then removed by the cook to be prepared for dinner, leading them to the conclusion that the meat had been poisoned while it was in the meat safe. On the day of Hubert's funeral, his father received a telegram from someone named Jay Hartigan, who was staying at the Dublin Hotel, with a message that simply read, "Hooray, hooray, hooray." Police were certain that the killer had sent the message, as Hubert's demise had not been reported in the newspapers yet. Investigators contacted the hotel, but found that no one by that name was staying there at the time. A few days later, a newspaper called the Daily Sketch published a photo of the telegram, and soon they received a postcard from Jay Hartigan asking why they had published it. 4 days later, Hubert's father also received a postcard from the same person, with this one stating, quote, "It's a mystery they will never solve. Jay Hartigan, hooray." Police attempted to ascertain a motive for the crime, but everyone they spoke to said Hubert was well liked, not only socially, but within the military as well. No similar poisonings were carried out again, ruling out the possibility of a serial poisoner, and no further clues were ever found. Jay Hartigan, whoever they were, got away with murder, leaving a creepy unsolved mystery in their wake. One of the most infamous unsolved true crime stories to ever come out of Queens, New York, occurred in 1964, and soon it became a media sensation. Kitty Genovese, a 28-year-old bartender, was driving home after her shift at around 2:30 a.m. on the 13th of March. She arrived at her house at about 3:15 a.m. and parked her car in the parking lot of Kew Gardens Long Island Railroad Station. She walked the 100 feet to her apartment's door, which was located in an alley behind the building, where she was confronted by a man named Winston Mosley. She realized that he was brandishing a sharpened blade, and she fled to the front of the building, but Mosley caught up with her and attacked her with the blade, causing her to scream for help. One of her neighbors, Robert Moser, heard her cries and yelled at Mosley to leave her alone. Mosley got scared and ran off, leaving Kitty to slowly make her way to the back of the building again. Witnesses reported seeing Mosley drive away, only to return a few moments later. He shielded his face with a wide-brimmed hat while searching the area, and eventually he found Kitty, who had been unable to make it to her apartment. Out of the sight of any witnesses, Mosley robbed her of $49 and attacked her with the blade again before fleeing once more. Sophia Farrar, a close friend of Kitty's, found her in the alleyway and stayed with her until an ambulance arrived. Kitty was taken to the hospital, but she passed away on the way. Mosley was arrested for stealing a television later that same week, and when his car, a white Corvair, was found to match that of Kitty's attacker, he was asked about the incident and he confessed. He stated that he had spotted her at a traffic light while he was sitting in his car. Kitty's attacker had been caught, but despite intense questioning, he never revealed his motive, and to this day, no one knows what prompted him to end her life. In 1902, 22-year-old Rose Harsett was living in Sussex, England. She was working as a servant at Providence House, where her life would be ended, sparking a mystery that has still not been solved. Rose was well liked, especially by the men in the area, and she had started having an affair with William Gardiner, a married choir master with 6 children. He and Rose had been caught together by 2 of the church's staff, and had been warned by the church, despite Gardiner's claims that it was all a lie. On the 31st of May, Rose received a letter reading, quote, I will try to see you tonight at 12 o'clock at your place. If you put a light in your window at 10 o'clock for about 10 minutes, then you can take it out again. Don't have a light in your room at 12, as I will come around the back." When her father, William, went to her quarters the next day, he found that she'd been attacked by someone with a blade and she was no longer alive. Her attacker had unsuccessfully attempted to set her alight with paraffin from a lamp after the fact. When the house was searched, the letter was quickly found, and Gardner became their prime suspect. When his handwriting was compared to that on the note, they decided that it was a match. Further evidence that pointed at Gardner included the bottle in which the paraffin was kept. It was a bottle usually used for medicine, and Gardner's children had been prescribed that same medicine recently. Also, a piece of paper that was used to attempt to light the paraffin was found to be from a newspaper that Gardner subscribed to. Witnesses also reported seeing Gardner standing outside of his house, staring at Providence House. A light had been briefly lit in the window, just as the note instructed. Gardner was, however, found not guilty of the crime, and Rose's attacker has still not been identified, leaving her case as a mystery that may never be solved. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.